Okay, thanks Emer, and welcome along everyone. We're delighted to have here another part of our affiliates program series where affiliates of IFA and member companies join together for some information sharing, for some insight, to get to know each other. Of course, we wish we were all in a big room together as we normally are, but we make do with this. It's working well, and we're very happy to continue the affiliates program in this format for as long as it's needed. So seldom in the world in time have so much attention been paid into the global biopharmaceutical industry as we search for both vaccines and indeed treatments and cures for COVID-19. The solutions which billions of people are earnestly looking for will come from scientists, who are many of whom are working in our industry, but also, of course, they're coming from unprecedented collaborations between government, between industry, between academia, universities, and so on and so forth, which you read about in the papers the whole time. Here in Ireland, most of our work in the last 3 months has been involved in these, making sure we have a supply of medicines constantly delivered into our health services, particularly, of course, medicines relating to COVID-19, but lots of others as well. And we are also supporting the efforts of the health services quite intensely. We work closely with the state authorities, both in Ireland and in Europe, at a very high and intensive level of cooperation. And of course, our industries and our companies, as many of you would have seen, are deeply involved in the search for a vaccine. And we hope that there will be good results on that before long. So this morning, this session is going to be focusing on reputation creation, reputation building, and of course, that is the meat and potatoes of Edelman, one of our affiliates, and itself a global player in this area of reputation and trust development. Joe Carmody will speak as Managing Director of Edelman, and we will also have our own Director of Communications and Advocacy, Bernard Millie, to put in position or place in context for us all what we've been doing as an industry in the last number of years. And I very much look forward to their presentations and indeed to the Q&A which will follow. I'm delighted that we have Fergal Purcell, Head of Public Affairs and former Government Press Secretary at Edelman as well, on hand for questions, and Niamh Garvey, Head of Edelman's Healthcare Practice. But for everybody is welcome. Everybody is welcome to put questions, and we hope we'll have a very informative session, and as usual that we will have to end before, while we're still crying out for more at the end of this. So thank you very much, Emer.
Okay, so maybe I'll kick off. Oliver, thank you for that introduction, and good morning to everybody on the call. My name is Bernard Millie. As Oliver has said, I'm the Director of Communications Advocacy for IPHA. So I'm going to share some slides with you just to kind of kick things off and get things moving. So first of all, a little bit about ourselves. So IFA represents the international research-based or originator biopharmaceutical industry here in Ireland. So our members are the likes of GSK and Pfizer, Novartis, Eli Lilly, and so on. And they discover and develop and manufacture and adopt innovative medicines for the health services to treat or cure medical conditions and diseases. So I guess our objective is to improve people's health through innovative medicines and technologies. And I guess our agenda splits into 3 parts. First of all, reputation is very important to us, as I said, and that means creating and sharing the industry story. So positioning as an enabler for better healthcare outcomes and more sustainable communities, progressive communities, economically vibrant communities, because of the jobs that we create in regions all across the country. Secondly, we gather insight perspectives on the future of medicine's innovation, and that then informs the policy agenda, and it strengthens our own story as well as an industry. And then thirdly, relationships are very important to us, including with our affiliates. And we leverage our reach across the government, research, patient advocacy, and clinical communities to build support for our agenda and to make possible the future for medicines innovation. And all that is guiding towards influencing the policy environment in a way that creates tomorrow's cures and treatments. And I suppose if you look at our recent work during the pandemic, we have found a new relevance, I think, in the world of coronavirus. As Oliver said, now more than any time before, innovators in the pharmaceutical world have found their voice as agents for change. And so therefore we had to move pretty early to define our coordinates in terms of our messaging, our story, to take out to Ireland and broader than that to Europe as well. And there are three categories that we found. First was science. That was obviously the search for vaccines and treatments. The second was supply, which means that we try to work as hard as we can to make sure there is no disruption in the supply of medicines to patients during the pandemic. That has been the case, and I think it's testament to the huge work that goes on in the companies all around the country to maintain the integrity of the supply chain. And thirdly, lots of companies are working behind the scenes to support charities, the voluntary sector, community organizations, hospitals, to get through this time and to help people who need help. And so therefore, that contribution financially or in kind has been really important for those organizations. And so therefore, we are here for Ireland in the crisis, and we believe that we will be here, perhaps more importantly, in the recovery phase too. And so we had to adapt our communications early on. We had a plan for the year in January that was quickly revised in February when the coronavirus hit. I found this picture online somewhere where some optician had ingeniously adapted their screens between customer and staff using glasses, and I thought it was pretty good. So it just indicates that, you know, we got to be able to move quickly and adapt quickly to changing circumstances in the communications world. And so when we look at our messaging, it is pretty consistent, we hope, all across our platforms. So we've had a digital first strategy, and we've supported that by traditional and online earned media. And so therefore behind that, you know, we are talking a lot to politicians and to officials about how we are helping the government to deal with the pandemic. But whatever platform we use, whether that's in political meetings, on social, in the media, it's hopefully a pretty consistent message, which is that we are here to help. And this industry is really consequential for Ireland. It always has been, but maybe that point is even more obvious today. And so we looked at how we might tell that story. What do you do to bring to life those three messaging coordinates that we had identified? So we sort of looked at, you know, video as being a good way to share a story, and that was fit across animated video content and user-generated video content. So I think the prevailing mood these days is that people are at home, they're working from home, they're not, you know, it's not a super slick production that we were looking for in this context. It was more to get the story out that this is an authentic effort to help the country out at a time of crisis. And so we developed 6 pieces of content so far, all under the Innovate for Life moniker, which is what we use to identify our brand purpose and to house our story. And so the first piece of content was about just vaccines, purely information on what they are, why they're important in the industry search. In our response, you know, 5 steps we're taking to help, or the 3 as we have now refined it to, as I explained earlier on, medicines.ie, which is a very important website for us. It's the place to go for trusted medicines information, which is regulator approved. Please do check it out if you haven't seen it already. Then we kind of pivoted a little bit to user-generated content. So we looked at the industry as a whole and people across all of our companies, you know, generated their own kind of self-shot, you know, homemade kind of pieces to camera, which they then sent us, and we wrapped all that stuff into one coherent piece of work, which told the story of the industry across science, supply, and support. Then we took that down to look at individual strands of that response effort. So, for example, in the manufacturing supply chain, we had a piece of content that's a snapshot of company level activities to keep making and supplying medicines. And then partnerships and supports was examples of how companies are helping the voluntary relief effort at a local level. And so the reach data, which we've just actually got in the last week or so, I think shows how the campaign landed. So we ran the campaign on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook between March and May. And then, so overall, the campaign recorded over 600,000 views, which we're pleased with, over 850,000 impressions, and 30,000 engagements, the vast majority of which were positive. I'll show you some examples of that video content and the reach in a minute. But not surprisingly, maybe the best performing video was actually the main industry montage, which had about over 180,000 views, which was really, really good for us. And it's the first time EVA has done this kind of work, and it's really impactful. And you're right there, you can see just a screenshot of the supports video which we ran out. This one is a snapshot or a screen grab of the industry montage. You'll see there the companies that took part in that effort. So we kind of did a kind of a gallery style a piece of work in which everybody had a say and everybody spoke to their particular contribution at a company level to the pandemic response. So I'm going to try and play this video. It's short, about 2.5 minutes long. Hopefully it works, but it tries to capture the manufacturing and supply chain response of the industry here in Ireland.
Here at Johnson & Johnson, our first priority is the safety and well-being of our employees. Thanks to our dedicated teams and robust business continuity plans, we are continuing to ensure the sustainable supply of our critical medicines for patients and healthcare professionals at this unprecedented time.
Here at Stellis in Kerry, we manufacture a life-saving immunosuppressant drug. Taking social distancing into account, by reconfiguring our manufacturing operations, we maintained our output while ensuring we have fewer staff on site. We keep going, so our patients do too.
At Pfizer, our colleagues across our 4 manufacturing sites have modified their shift patterns and working arrangements to ensure we continue to supply over 100 critical medicines to our patients across the globe during this pandemic.
Changing how we work does not impact the high quality standards we have at Novartis Ringaskiddy. All of our colleagues, whether working from home or working on site, are continuing to ensure we deliver high quality medicine to our patients.
At Ipsen, we are doing everything possible to protect our work colleagues while they continue their pivotal work to manufacture and maintain supply of essential medicines for people living with cancer worldwide.
Here at GSK Dungarvan, we've amended our work practices to protect our essential workers and to ensure that we supply our medicines to Ireland and around the globe.
Here at Sanofi Waterford, we're working through the crisis to maintain the supply of vital medicines to patients. We've adjusted some of how we work to protect ourselves and to protect others. While we look forward to things getting back to normal for everybody, it's motivating to know that our essential work in helping people just like us and our families, but who have the extra burden of a rare disease, will keep going so they can.
Okay, so let's try and move that on.
Industry, and we innovate for the world. We host all 10.
Okay, sorry about this now, just lost the presentation. So hopefully everybody got to see that, and it's a nice little piece of work. It just shows the extent and the breadth of the kind of impact that the industry has across the country. And this slide here is a very quick snapshot of some of the reach that we generated and where the story landed across social media platforms. So you'll see a lot of examples there of where it's been retweeted and shared by some of our companies and some of our partners, both in government, in the kind of the agency and research world, and of course by our stakeholders, including in Europe. You can see FPA there, and NIBRT, for example, Eamon Quinn in the Department of Health. So there's been lots of really good examples of how this has been well received, and we're really grateful for the support that the industry actually gave us during this campaign, because without them supplying their content to us and getting behind the campaign to amplify it, we wouldn't have been able to achieve the reach that we did. So I really appreciate that. So if you look at this slide, I mean, this is interesting because it shows through a tool that we use here to measure social distance reach, the kind of words that are associated with the campaign when people post online about it. So in that word cloud there, what jumps out, not surprisingly, maybe are words like manufacturing, supply, patients, recovery, Ireland, medicines, and so on. Innovate for Life is in there too, which is really good to see, because that means the hashtag was used a lot. So the themes then are, as you see on the bottom, and the sentiment is quite positive. So a lot of really positive sentiment on LinkedIn, which probably isn't surprising, but it is really good to see 50% of people, their reactions were positive, and the same number neutral. There were no negative. The only negative actually was on Twitter. Again, probably not surprising, but the majority of people there were neutral, and 13.8% positive. Facebook, pretty even split between neutral and positive. So we're really pleased with that result. So when we looked at the campaign, then we said, look, we've got to try and find a way to make sure this lands on media as well. Now it's not easy, because this content is quite kind of industry focused, and it's not particularly newsy. But we found a way to find news angles out of it. So, for example, during World Immunization Week at the end of April, that was an ideal platform for us to talk about the future of vaccines and the vaccine search, where we are at with that. And so we work with our partners and companies to put people out on shows like Morning Ireland and Business. Oliver was on with Ivan Yates on News Talk a couple of weeks back as well. We had some opinion editorials in the Irish Times, in the Examiner, in the Mail. There were some Irish Times think pieces which we would have influenced and briefed on, and then lots of tabloid and online coverage as well. So the briefing of journalists actually is something that we do a lot here, because some of them are interested in pharma, some of them are interested in healthcare, and more of them are interested in neither, but are attuned to the news agenda. So we have to try and cater for all of those interests and find a way to get ourselves into the conversation about where the vaccine search is going in particular. And that's not always easy, because you've got lots of academics actually in the world as well who are usually first to be asked by journalists for comment. So we have to keep pushing to get ourselves into the frame. This is just a very quick snapshot of some of the headlines that we've generated in the last number of weeks. You'll see there's a good cross section of tabloid and broadsheet coverage online as well. There's also a lot of engagement at official and political levels. So as I said earlier on, we try to mirror what we say in public with what we say in private to officials and to politicians. So there's lots of work going on between us and the Department of Health and HPRA, HSE, in terms of the supply chain activities. I'm on an industry communications task force with the Department of Health that tries to keep the message fairly well aligned. The health party spokespersons are kept briefed on what the industry is doing, where they are available to talk to us. That is, not too busy with program for government stuff. And they were also plugged into the European response through our work with our colleagues in Brussels at FPA. And so just lastly, a couple of points, reflections as to where this might be going for the industry. I mean, COVID-19 has been devastating for families, devastating for communities across the country and the world. And, you know, our first thoughts are with them and how they are handling their response. But for the industry perspective, I think reputationally, it's been a good thing. It's helped us to show our value in society beyond the narrow price row. It's enabled us to really show what we actually do. And so I think if we handle this well globally, it will help us even further. However, there are downside and upside consequences. First of all, budgets will be even more stretched than they are, which isn't good for the reimbursement of medicines potentially. And there will be, we expect, greater use of cost containment measures. Secondly, companies will invest billions in the vaccines and treatment research, but most of that money will never yield anything, and they will probably lose it. In fact, they will in many cases. And so that isn't a good thing either for the industry. There may be a retreat to protectionist health policies, a reversal of globalization. There could be some vaccine nationalism. We've seen some of that already in the States. And it's something we've got to watch out for that and guard against it. There may be a shift in R&D priorities and move towards prevention, diagnosis and screening. But I think there is renewed appreciation of the upside or the value of medicines innovation, of manufacturing and supply chain, and of proper data gathering. There may be shorter regulatory pathways for medicine development, but making sure there is no risk of compromise on safety. And I think we'll see closer collaboration between industry and governments around the world in shaping the health landscape. And only last week, Europe's health ministers agreed a European Commission plan to use a large majority of a 2.7 billion emergency fund for advanced purchase deals with the pharmaceutical industry for potential COVID-19 vaccines. So I think what that shows is that there's a willingness to make an upfront investment in vaccine development to ensure that they are produced at speed and scale once they become available, and hopefully that will happen very soon. Two last slides. The first is Ken Fraser here, who's the CEO of Merck, or in Europe known as MSD, made a very telling comment about the tragic incident in Minnesota at the death of George Floyd a couple of weeks ago. And he said that George Floyd could be me. And that's an example, I think, of where increasingly you have global CEOs inserting themselves into the conversation about what it is to be a commentator or somebody with a point of view on events that happen in the world. Even though you might be running a company, you have a voice. And that's increasingly the case now, as we see around the world. Other companies have also commented on this incident, including Novartis and Pfizer and many others. But I think Ken Fraser's interjection is particularly significant. And lastly, today is Bloomsday. So happy Bloomsday. There is a chemist shop down on Western Road, you'll all know it, called Sweeney's. No longer functioning as a chemist shop, but it's where Leopold Bloom famously bought his lemon scented soap. And he said that chemists rarely move. And that might be true of the retail pharmacy. But when it comes to medicines innovation, they certainly have to move very fast to keep up with the pace of change in that world. So I'm going to hand over now to Joe, who will take you through the fascinating results of the Edelman Trust Barometer. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Bernard, and good morning, everybody. Just waiting for my screen to share here, if you can bear with me. I might just difficulty in sharing the screen here, and it's quite ironic. Technology is the most. Oh, here we are. Thank you. Hopefully. Okay, I might just continue without the aid of slides if that's okay, and for everybody, and hopefully the technology will catch up here. Thanks, Bernard, and good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you. Firstly, to introduce the Trust Barometer, which is now in its 20th year. We survey 33,000 people in 28 countries annually to examine the state of trust in the 4 institutions that underpin the well-being of our economy and of our society. Those institutions are government, business, media, and NGOs. We also examine trust on a sectoral basis, from technology to financial services and healthcare. And of course, healthcare is the topic of today's conversation. Since the outbreak of COVID-19, we have been tracking levels of trust, and a third piece of research since February. The findings we are sharing today were in field in mid-April, about 6 weeks into Europe and the US going into lockdown. And if there's a single theme for all of you to take back into your organizations from the barometer in April, it is one of positivity. It shows a very significant increase in trust in healthcare, particularly in biopharma. The improvement is reflective of how pharma has responded to the needs of people and society during COVID, and Bernard has given us a very good picture of what that has looked like. As we face into the period ahead, there are key questions for the industry, and those questions revolve around how to safeguard this increased level of trust and to identify how it might be leveraged to yield results. I'm joined by my colleagues Fergal Purcell, who is our Head of Public Affairs and former Government Press Secretary, and Niamh Garvey, Edelman's Head of Health, and we'll be exploring those questions as we go through the presentation. Both will join at various points. Before turning to healthcare, I want to look at the state of trust globally first. And what it shows during the crisis that we've gone through is that people have rallied around the institutions that they have traditionally depended on. And trust in all 4 institutions of government, business, media, and NGOs has soared to an all-time high. The reason behind these increases during COVID is that each institution has met the expectation that society has placed on it. Traditional media provided quality information on the pandemic. Government protected its citizens. Businesses moved from just selling to offering solutions, and NGOs supported the vulnerable. There is a key question here, and that is whether these levels of trust are sustainable, or whether this is a type of trust bubble with the inevitable downside that follows any bubble. The answer to that question depends on whether each institution is prepared to continue to meet the expectations of society as we move into the next phase of COVID. That may involve continuing to sacrifice self-interest for community interest. It is a key question for business, and it's a key question for the biopharma industry as to whether they will continue to index towards problem solving in society as well as selling to society. As well as the very significant increase in trust in biopharma, the barometer also shows a resurgence in trust in government. This has relevance for pharma, and I'll pass over to Fergal to share his perspectives on government.
Hi everybody, and it's lovely to meet you all virtually. And Bernard, thanks for an excellent presentation. Fantastic insights and great work to everyone in IFA. Hi to all the members out there. I hope you're doing okay in what continues to be the new normal. Joe has hit the nail on the head there to say that pharma are having a moment, and they're not the only ones in terms of trust. Government too are having a moment, and I think it's absolutely critical for pharma to know where government are at at any given time, given they are a key partner, and given, as Oliver and Bernard have pointed out, the nature of the work that is now pulsed as a result of this particular moment in time that we are in. I mean, who would have thought? I mean, Brexit sounded like it was far-fetched. Trump sounded far-fetched. Boris Johnson sounded far-fetched, but no one saw this pandemic, and certainly no one saw the sort of moment in the firmament where government and pharma are crossing, their paths are crossing right now in a very, very sweet spot. And to give the bottom line up front, the assertion here is, what does that mean, and what can be gained from it for all parties? Just to move on to the next slide there, or am I to do that? Yeah, there we go. Okay, so what has happened is an enormous pulse in trust in government, up 11 points in a matter of 3 months. If you look at it there, government on the trust index overall at 61 and government at 65. Now, what do we do in times of crisis? We hold tight to nurse. I mean, we know that. 1.1 million watched Katrina Perry on the 6-1 news during Storm Emma, for example. We go to where we feel safe. And that is a huge reason as to why pharma's reputation has pulsed as well. I mean, the idea that you would go up, a government would go up 11 points in that period of time is absolutely unprecedented in the 2 decades of the Edelman Trust Barometer. That has never happened before. Now, why has these trust levels gone up? Because on all the metrics of how the public expect governments to behave, if you look at the left-hand side there, the strongest mandate for government to lead in all areas of the pandemic response. So if you look at the various headings, containing the pandemic, informing the public, providing economic relief and support, helping people cope, and getting us back to normal. Not ironically, the getting us back to normal. It's easy, put a blanket down, it seems. It seems that this particular blanket of restriction is going to have to be peeled back piece by piece. It's much, much harder. Now, you would look at these and say, well, this is what we would expect a government to do. We would expect them to take measures to contain the pandemic restrictions. We would expect them to inform the public through John Concannon-driven, very coherent communications policies. We would expect them to provide economic support, help people cope, and get us back to normal. But the difference this time is that people believe that they're doing their job. And that is absolutely critical for, I believe, the relationship with pharma as well, because you're in a moment. Innovate for Life has been absolutely outstanding to complement Aoife on that. And the question now is, and we'll come to this at the end, is, so what do we do now? Are we in a moment, and is this level, are these levels of trust sustainable? Look at the programme for government that was published yesterday. Silent on payment for medicines, very heavy on the importance of FDI, and very heavy on the issue of a recommitment to the 12.5%. All of a sudden, your jobs are no longer taken for granted in a way they might have been 3 months ago. And we have a suggestion towards the end of the presentation as to how we might capitalise on this moment in time. Joe?
Okay, thanks, Fergal. Turning back to trust in healthcare, it is at an all-time high. Like government, it is the rising star. And if we just move on to the next slide, from January to May 2020, trust increased by 8 points, making the sector record a trust level overall globally of 75%. This is the largest trust increase we have seen in healthcare since healthcare has been included in the Trust Barometer. Also, if you look at the global trends here from 2016, increases and decreases were relatively minor, and healthcare has always been trusted over that period, but it has never recorded the high levels of trust that we're seeing today. As I mentioned earlier, the trend in the barometer is that trust booms are often followed by trust busts. So this is a really important moment for the biopharma sector and healthcare in general to understand what is driving and to safeguard those higher levels of trust on a long-term basis. Just moving to the next slide, I just want to put this in a sectoral context. Healthcare has been included in the Trust Barometer for 10 years. For most of that time, technology was the most trusted sector, and since 2008, in the aftermath of the financial crash, as you would expect, financial services was the least trusted. Health was always mid-table. In April, levels of trust in the healthcare sector surged. Now, you'll see from the slide here that many industries experienced an increase in trust, but the sectors that saw the most significant increase were those on the front line, the food and beverage sector and the biopharma sector. These industries met the essential needs of people, and those essential needs during the crisis being food and medicine. So all eyes have been on healthcare to provide solutions during COVID, and that will continue as a vaccine is sought. With this increased levels of trust comes increased expectations, and part of sustaining trust in the sector will be managing those expectations and managing those expectations through transparent communications. Just moving to the next slide. Another promising opportunity for healthcare is the resurgence in experts. They are back in vogue. The most trusted voices during the pandemic have been those of doctors, scientists, and national health officials. Many have become household names, and 85% of people want to hear more from these experts than from politicians. I think there's a broader opportunity here. More than ever, these experts are your allies, and there's an opportunity to get intentional with these partners in support of the industry's objectives in the weeks and months ahead. The next slide. The increase in trust in healthcare is broad and deep and goes across all sectors, from hospitals to health insurers to biotech. The most significant increase across these sectors has been in pharma, and I'm going to hand over to Niamh to share some of her perspectives on this increase.
Good morning, everyone, and excellent presentations, Aoife. Across all industry sectors, as Joe said, with the exception of food and beverage, biopharma has had the most remarkable shift in trust, double-digit increases in 6 of the 11 markets surveyed. And geographically, this mirrors the trust findings within the healthcare environment that Joe mentioned. The US, Germany, and Canada saw the largest increases. And these are key markets for many of your companies. And historically, these markets tend to trend to the lower threshold of trust. This level of trust represents record-breaking highs for biopharma, and it's remarkable when one considers that 2 years ago, trust plummeted to an all-time low. Of course, this leap in trust is not altogether surprising. As we know, we're in the middle of an unprecedented health crisis, and all eyes are on healthcare and pharma to provide solutions. The public is in fact relying on pharma for an urgently needed vaccine, as well as new and repurposed treatments to mitigate the effects of COVID. Indeed, the pandemic and the collective response has provided a moment of reckoning of sorts for the pharma industry, really a platform to bolster what we can say is a tarnished image, to alter the profits over patient perception, and to positively affect the narrative to demonstrate the value of medicines that pharma brings, as Bernard mentioned earlier. While pharma is not typically a term of endearment, I think that we can now hypothesize that the size, the structure, the global footprint of pharma is a source of comfort for people. They feel that the industry is poised to lead the way in new developments and discoveries, indeed beyond COVID. As Bernard also mentioned earlier, pharma has positioned itself as an enabler for better health outcomes, really walking the talk. But of course, these higher levels of trust in pharma are not likely to remain, and there's no room for complacency. COVID and beyond, it is important that we realise that this current level will not insulate biopharma against the all too familiar negative rhetoric of outstanding issues such as pricing and speed of access to medicines. These conversations have not evaporated, certainly not in the Irish market. Neither too have the questions on investment, innovation, on solving some of the biggest global health issues and preventable curable diseases. In addition, along with increased levels of trust comes increased scrutiny and continued expectation to demonstrate sustained commitment to collaboration, to transparency around exchange of information, to acceleration of clinical trials. So really, in summary, the precedent has now been set, and pharma will be expected to lead, to solve problems, to protect all, and to collaborate, not just within the healthcare setting, but in the interest of society at large.
Thanks, Niamh. I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the opportunity to safeguard trust in health. And if I could just ask Amy to move on 2 slides, please. There's a real opportunity to identify with employees within the biopharma sector. So not only are we seeing an increase in trust externally, we're also seeing in trust internally. Employees have a key role to play in safeguarding trust. They are actually the most trusted ambassador for business, and across all sectors that we study as part of the trust barometer, employees come out as the most trusted advocate, irrespective of what sector they're operating in. Next slide, please. When we look at employees specifically in healthcare, we've seen a 5-point increase in employee trust since January 2020. In the same way that there's an opportunity to work with those trusted experts to advocate on your behalf, there's also an opportunity to activate employees and have them carry the story of the pharma industry and its values. And I was struck by some of the videos that Bernard showed earlier on, because it appears to be very much the strategy, putting employees front and centre in terms of telling the story of the industry. Next slide. We also looked at some of the reasons behind the increase in trust, and it is attributable to employees feeling that their employers within healthcare were well prepared for the pandemic and were also performing well in their response to it and in how they managed the crisis. Just moving on, the second pillar in safeguarding trust is leading with innovation. We looked at trust in technology in detail in our 2020 Edelman Barometer study, and trust in health innovation was amongst the highest across any sector, trusted by 63% of people globally. And if we can just move on the slide, you will see that trust in innovation was ahead of AI, driverless cars, cryptocurrencies. So people are drawing a very clear line between health innovation and its positive impact on society. Of course, there is a double-edged sword here in that healthcare companies are simply expected to make continued advancements. The expectation is that they will continually innovate, and we're seeing that now in terms of the conversation around vaccinations for COVID. So explaining the impact of innovation and managing expectations around it will be key to maintaining in the period ahead. And I'll bring Fergal in here on the next slide to elaborate on that point.
Okay, briefly, to make the point I said earlier that we would come up with a suggestion, and I'm going to do that on the back of this slide. So if it's the case that our findings are that trust businesses involved, 64% of people trust businesses involved in personalised medicines, for example, and gene mapping to do what is right, but that 78% of that very same cohort know little or nothing about them. That speaks to me of licence. Now, if it's the case that all this fantastic work has been done in relation to a kind of a mutual esteem that has arisen between particularly government and pharma, but across society as well, where we've had common cause as a society, but particularly, for example, in the continuing to export medicines with government and pharma cooperating on that matter. What we have is a hunch that the public agree with us there. What we don't have is sectoral reputational research to prove it. So in the same way that we invoke the programme for government, which is silent on the reimbursement issue and money medicines, and as Bernard so cogently put it, the stretched health budgets that are going to be, and not to move to the narrow conversation around reimbursement immediately. But if it's the case that we're in a particular moment, there is an enormous benefit, to my mind, in putting an empirical floor underneath that esteem by recruiting the public support, specifically by establishing sectoral reputational research in that space that would beautifully complement Innovate for Life, which is the industry speaking. But what we're suggesting is a listening exercise, hear what they have to say and frame a compelling narrative around it. Then you've got your third leg of the stool that will sustain you and keep momentum in the esteem and trust levels that currently exist. Joe.
Thanks, Fergal. Okay, just to conclude on the number of takeouts on how the industry can safeguard the high levels of trust that it has earned. And if we can just move to the next slide, please, Amy. The first one is showing the tangible actions that the industry is taking to benefit people in their real lives. This has been very visible during COVID. We saw all of the content that has gone across multiple channels that Bernard shared earlier on. Individual companies are doing good, but they must be known to do good. So as we emerge into the next phase of COVID, a key message here is to continue to share stories of impact and the impact that the industry is having on people's real lives. Work with experts. They're the most trusted. They can be our allies and they can help deliver the objectives of the industry. In an era of fake news, there is an opportunity to be a source of trustworthy information. We need to ensure that we don't just rely on traditional media to tell our story. As I mentioned earlier, partnering with employees is a key opportunity. Like experts, they are the most trusted to tell the story of the industry and its value. And I think this is probably the most critical one. Be at the centre of significant societal change. Our trust data shows that society values competence in business, but it places more value on businesses that operate with a sense of fairness and purpose. Businesses that are recognised for affecting positive change in people's everyday lives are operating with a trust premium. That's what the industry, the healthcare industry, and including and specifically the biopharma industry has done during COVID. Bernard talked about this earlier, as did Oliver, in terms of the importance of science, the importance of keeping the supply chain moving, and the importance of supporting communities. So the impact of all of the activity under each of those pillars has meant that the industry has been extremely visible in having an impact on people's everyday lives. The final element, which Fergal touched on, is connecting the innovation agenda of the industry to the public expectation, and linking that innovation agenda to the impact that the industry has on people and their well-being. So there are some of the, I suppose, the key learnings from the barometer. And as we said at the outset, I think the questions for the industry moving forward are how to safeguard the hard-earned trust that has been won, and how to identify what opportunities exist to leverage that trust to deliver results for the industry. So thank you. That concludes the findings, and happy to take any questions.
Hi Joe, that's great. Thanks a million for that, and to Fergal and Nia for your contributions, and of course to Bernard. So I suppose we can open up the floor to any questions. If you have questions, please by all means type them into the chat box and we will address them when we can. So just to kick it off, I suppose, Fergal, I'm going to go back to your idea there in terms of what we should do next. But Bernard, I'm going to reach out to you in terms of Innovate for Life, and just I suppose in terms of the pandemic and COVID, what direction do you see Innovate for Life going in now, taking on board what Fergal just kind of said there as well?
Thanks, Emer. Good question. So I think we need to do a transition from crisis to recovery and reflect what's happening in the economy, in society, and hopefully that will happen in the next number of months. Reflect that through the contribution that we can make as an industry to making that transition happen. So if you look at what we've been doing using the Innovate for Life hashtag, we've done this campaign with user-generated content that's, as the guy said earlier on, is employee-led, and it's very much a grassroots up sort of campaign. Moving that along then to say, well, if that was the problem, and if that's a statement of how we're dealing with it in the here and now, then where is the future going for the country, and what is the industry's role in enabling better healthcare outcomes, more regionally distributed economic growth, the promise of innovation in medicines in things like cell and gene therapy, genomics. All that agenda has to be, I think, in the next iteration of Innovate for Life, and we have to be the people who voice it. So our companies do it brilliantly, but they do it on a company by company basis and according to their portfolio of products and their interests in certain therapy areas. Our role, though, is to tell a whole of industry story right across, discovery, development, manufacturing, and adoption of innovative medicines. And that is the IFA agenda. That's the one that we have to own and take forward. And there is a space for that industry to be much more vocal in the time ahead. And hopefully that's where Innovate for Life will go next.
Fergal, would you have any thoughts on that? Or I suppose you're the one who came up with that concept there in your slide. So would you have any advice?
I'd better back it up, Emer, as you. Yeah, absolutely. I think, like, just to not to be embarrassing Bernard and Oliver, and just because we're on the IFA piece here, but if you were to take where you are now versus where you were 6 months ago, to call it straight, you're in a transformed position. Now, you've caught a bit of a break, but you've really capitalized on it. And I think if you do, I think there's an opportunity now to take a further action. So I'll give it to you very plainly. The government tested all their COVID messaging on the public before they went with it. Lives depended on the messaging having efficacy. So I'm aware that the government would have literally tested all their messaging so that we would all obey the restrictions. What our research does is the global effect of what the public think of pharma. It doesn't measure specifically here in Ireland. And I think when you end up sitting across the table, whether it be in reimbursement or any other conversation, when the rubber hits the road, do you have public opinion on your side, and can you just show that as leverage? Because there's one thing a politician will listen to is what the public say. So what you've done with Innovate for Life is you've coalesced the industry. The piece that could complement that is to coalesce the public with you and to put an empirical floor underneath where you're at. If it's good enough for the government to test their messaging and create a compelling narrative, why not you? You're their chief partner now. I suppose that's it in a nutshell.
Bernard, do you want to jump in there, or are you happy enough with all that?
I'm good with that. Maybe Oliver would like to make a comment if he's there.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Fergal, you are embarrassing me. Look how red I turned while you were talking. It's awful to be complimented as not something I'm totally unused to here in the back rooms of IFA. But look, first of all, if things have been transformed, it is because of all those people in our member companies who appeared on those videos and who actually are doing the work and are actually telling the story of what their companies are doing, both in terms of supporting the health care service and indeed the research and so on and so forth, and bringing new therapies and discovering the new vaccines. So it is one of the strong takeaways I will take from the presentation, and I do accept your point, Fergal, to go measure and see where you're at. It's terribly important. We have to do that. But the strongest takeaway I have is that communicating through people, that is through clinicians and through employees, is immensely powerful and has worked very, very well. It tells the story. Of course, the substance has to be there. It also implies to me that there is a, as you pointed out, Fergal, there is a gap. There is a need for content, for stories to be told, to fill the yearning, if that's not too strong a word, for trust to be fulfilled. People do trust, but without having information. So we do need to provide that information at all levels, and to do that with the, to engage with the public as well. But I see this presentation has been extremely useful both to our members and to other affiliates involved in doing business with our companies, because it does begin our thinking, and you guys, Netherlands, may be a bit ahead of us on this, but it begins our thinking about, well, where do we go next and what do we do next? We have done this together with our members through the crisis, but we do have to work on, right, how do we build on that and where do we take it next? And it is very important, because it is an inflection point. I was frankly happy, very surprised by that jump from whatever it was, 58 to 73% very gratified by that. It's great to see that happen in major markets, and I hope I was taken that Ireland is in that position as well. But it is something we have to think quite deeply about and act upon, as you suggest, Fergal, Joe, Niamh, that we would actually, take this forward. So thank you very much for all these insights. We will certainly give us a lot of pause for thought and reasons to sort of move on confidently in the future. But I'll say it again, and it's not to be cheesy. Thank you to our members who have supplied the content, without which IFA can do nothing.
I have another couple of minutes here before we can sign off. So I just have just a question for Joe and for Fergal and Niamh, I suppose, in terms of communications in the government. So we saw the Ipsos MRBI opinion poll that came out last night with government satisfaction at 72%, Leo Varadkar's ratings up to 75%, and this would be in stark contrast to what we saw back in February. And I suppose that kind of reflects your findings within in terms of trust in government. But in terms of their communications, I mean, they've done a lot of things right, but the whole situation with schools, what's happening with schools, the face masks, they've been coming back and forth with a lot of their messaging. What are your views on that? What could they have done differently? What should they be doing more of? I'd be interested to hear your views.
Joe, will I take that, or Joe? Or?
Yeah, no, go ahead, Fergal. Yeah.
Okay. I think it's easy to throw a blanket down. I think it's awfully hard to pick the blanket up. I think that's what's happening in terms of communications. And I would have worked very closely with John Concannon in years gone by. He clearly has been fairly totemic in centralising their messaging there. I don't think anyone could accuse them of anything else of compelling and coherence. However, I have strong ties through family connections with the medical side of the world, and the whole issue of masks and the issue of schools reflect the fact that both of them are very vexed issues. The reality is that one of the things the government are communicating, and they're not going to say this, but the reality is, from talking to people in there, that they're going to have to communicate calculated risk going forward. That's a very hard message. So, for example, if my kids, 3 of whom are in this house today, hopefully running around fully clothed, if they're going back to school or creche or whatever it is, there's an element of risk attached to that regardless. There's an element of risk attached, and how do you communicate that? So I think it's very, very difficult. I think government, in summary, government communications has hit a bit of a natural stumble in the road, and I do think it'll get past it, but it's because of the vexed nature of the issues rather than any incompetence on their own behalf, I would have thought. I think the change in government, very quickly, the change in government is going to be very challenging. I think Micheál Martin's an excellent politician. I think he's shown great forbearance and patience. He's stepping into what has been perceived to be a successful position of recent, and I've every faith in him. I don't think that's going to be easy, though. And I think the bar that the media have kept for the government has been fairly low. They're going to raise the bar now. So we're in for an interesting communications time ahead.
The challenge is ahead for them, so the honeymoon period is over.
Question. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, look, it is 9:31. We promised we'd keep you for an hour. So I just want to thank Joe and Fergal and Niamh and Bernard for the contributions. And I hope everybody found it of use. And please come back to me, Emer Leary, if you have any questions, if you want slides, whatever. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.